Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Tonight's guest wants to remain anonymous, so I'm just going to call him Mike. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Mike, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
I'm 30 years old. I'm 6'2", average between 240, 260. Was very athletic in school, bench pressed 375 pounds, ran to try and lose weight and stay fit. And I've just tried staying pretty well in shape most of my life.
From the age of 3 to the age of 10, Mike, you had a huge fear of werewolves. What's the story behind that?
Well, when I was 3, my parents, for some reason, I guess I was asleep and woke up in the midst of it all, thought that watching Silver Bullet would be an amazing thing that night. And because of that, from the age of 3 until about 10, I had such a horrible fear that I could say the word werewolf in a day, maybe twice, and that night I would have a horrific nightmare. But on top of the fear of it, it also fascinated me by werewolves.
Yeah, they are a fascinating but terrifying topic. There's no denying that. Do you still watch werewolf movies and study them?
Yes, I do. Actually, the way I thought of it was to be terrified of something is to understand its weaknesses. Because if you take something that's so powerful and you find out what its weakness is, it kind of takes the power away from what you're scared of.
That's a good point. Since you had your encounter, you've been dealing with some serious anxiety issues. Please tell us about them.
Well, any time I go outside after dark to take the trash out or just to help my wife and little girl inside, I'll keep my head down and just do what I'm doing and act like nothing's wrong. But the entire time I am outside, I make sure I'm listening at all times for anything. I just stay nervous most of the time when it's dark out, unless I'm in a very well-lit area or in town.
After you have an experience like that, it's only natural to fear the dark and have trouble doing things outside like that, especially after dark. From what I understand, through your life, you've had several paranormal experiences, but your Dogman encounter scared you more than any of those other experiences. Please tell us more about that.
I have lived in a house that was accompanied by 3 ghosts, and it was me and 2 roommates. And we knew they were ghosts for the simple fact that electronics that were plugged into the same thing or off the same power cord would actually, if he was watching a movie, the TV would get turned off while the movie still went on. TV was brand new. Or a game would go off while you was playing it and the TV would stay on. We had a touch light that you had to tap to actually get it to brighten up. Anytime you would say that you needed to find something, the light without being touched would go out. There were times that we would hear glasses break or plates break or something being thrown across the room. And when we was on the other side of the house, when we came in, there was no sign of anything broken anywhere. And the third ghost was a little girl with long black hair in a black dress that always stood in the corner where the washer and dryer went. And every time that you'd walk through, she would stand there and you'd see her out of the corner of your eye. When you went to look at her, she would disappear into the wall. We found out later that that house was 150 feet away from a graveyard. And 2 years after that, we found the graveyard, and that land was actually where Indians were buried, Indian burial ground. So a lot of goodness there, and that compared nothing to the encounter.
Well, those sound like some awfully creepy experiences to me. If they don't compare to the Dogman encounter, then that says a lot. A few nights before you had your encounter, you noticed something strange in the area where you lived. What was so strange that night?
Where it happened, there were a lot of dogs, and it's in Kentucky, so you are always surrounded by the woods. So you always hear everything. Growing up in Kentucky, you hear what's in the woods. You hear frogs, insects, everything. And the weird thing is, when you go outside, no matter what time of year it is, you will always hear something. But when it is so deathly silent that when you walk, your footsteps feel like they echo, that is so unnerving.
That would be awfully creepy. Before you tell us about your encounter, please tell us about the area where it happened.
At the time, I was living in an apartment complex, and you would turn off the 4-lane onto the road where the apartment complex would be. And it was about 20 buildings, front and back apartments, bottom and top stairs. And they maybe had anywhere from 15 to 25 feet apart. And they were all in the same area and conjoined by 2 giant parking lots that were well lit. And you would leave them, go up the road, and there were houses pretty close together. Right after you left the parking lot on your right, there was a house that said where actually a police officer lived, and they had a pit bull they called Thor that was 180 pounds. Would always bark, was always tied up so he couldn't get loose or anything, but he would always bark. And then you had a family across the road from them, and then you'd go up a ways, and there was a creek beside the road. You could take another road, and that would be farther up into another ending of the road. But if you kept straight, that's where I would always go. And it would go all the way paved until so far, and then it would turn to gravel. Well, right before it turned to gravel, on the left, there was a house there that an old man lived at, and he had died about 7 years ago. And he had an open field property where just his house sat, and it was flat land, and then at the back of it, it would go into the woods. Given all around where there were houses, within 20 to 30 feet from the house was surrounded by woods. There was a bridge that went to that house, and there was a flood, and it broke the bridge off and washed it away. So it left about a 7-foot gap between the road and that property. You would walk up farther, and after that house, maybe 150 feet, lived my aunt. And then after that, some more open field. There's 2 more houses, and then after you go past that, on the left, on the top of a hill that was gravel, lived my cousin. And I would go there frequently just to relax, play games, just spend time with, because we've always been really close, like brothers. And if you go farther up the road, it would go and show maybe 2, 3 more houses, and then it was nothing but open forest, and you could go up the creek into the forest, which was a 4-wheeler trail.
It sounds like it was a pretty sizable forest.
You are surrounded by the forest at all times. It basically was a giant bowl. In the middle was all the houses on the flat land, and then when the hills came in was the forest. And walking beside the abandoned house on your right, when you're right in front of the abandoned house, well, right after you pass the abandoned house going up the road, on the right was where they had literally cut the mountain in half to where they just put the road through. So there was about a 15 to 20 foot tall rock wall that was just flat all the way down until it went back to where it was just forest again. But at the top of the rock wall was nothing but wooded area.
Yeah, it sure sounds to me like a perfect area for Dogmen. All right, Mike, please tell us about your encounter. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Well, I would normally leave my cousin's house between anywhere from 11:30 to 2 o'clock in the morning, because from where I lived to his house was an easy 20-minute walk. 20 minutes shouldn't be that bad. And when I was walking down his gravel hill, to my left at one of the houses at the end of the holler, there was a dog, and it sounded like it was going crazy. Like, this wasn't a bark like, oh, I know you're there, or something like that, towards me. It was barking at something like it was terrified. And then it just stopped. And I brushed it off thinking, well, maybe it's just thinking, oh, well, I'm walking on gravel, it can hear me, it's just probably saying, get away from my territory. Didn't think anything of it. But once the dog stopped barking, it was dead silent. And on all through this, it was extremely foggy out to where I had maybe a 20 to 25 visibility range. It was so thick of fog, and the wind was blowing, not extremely hard, but enough to where it would mix the fog up, but not blow it away. So it was a little bit of a colder night. It was in the middle of September when this happened. So I walked down my cousin's hill, and I started walking on the road. And there are street lights on this road, one at my cousin's house, and then you go 200 feet, and you see another one at my aunt's house. Then you go maybe 100 to 150 more feet, and there's another one. And after that, there's one maybe every 50 to 75 feet where you get in the apartment complex area. So I was walking, and it was so silent I could hear my footsteps echoing. I kept on looking around because I just felt like something was wrong. It didn't feel right. It just felt something wasn't right in the air. And I just started going, didn't think anything of it. It was like, well, I'll be home in maybe 10 minutes, no problem. I got to the open field beside of the abandoned house, and I heard this deep, just god-awful, just low growl. And I looked to my right, and in the middle of that open field, the grass had grown up, and it was dying out because of the cold weather, and I saw two glowing ember yellow eyes staring at me. And I could see the silhouette of a dog's head. But the thing that worried me was the body it was attached to was laying in the field. And all I seen was this giant black mass, and I thought it was a bear. But I couldn't really understand at that time why there could be a dog this big. And I just kept on staring, and then on the rock wall to my left, 15 to 20 feet up, something moved and knocked down 2 to 3 rocks. And these weren't pebbles or something from something small. These rocks were smaller than a bowling ball, but bigger than a softball. Like something wanted my attention to go away. And when I heard them slam down, they were 2 feet away from me. And I looked, and it was, if that, of 2 seconds. And I looked back, and the eyes were gone. There was nothing in the field. And it literally shook my soul for something that big to move and me not hear one thing. I always carry a pocket knife with me. And I had it in my pocket. I got it out, held it in my hand, opened it up, and started walking faster. Well, this dog at the officer's house that was barking all the time, this huge massive pit bull was in its house, softly whimpering like it didn't want anything to know it was there. And in this fog, I could hear footsteps. And they were really heavy. And they were moving from side to side around me. And from the rocks falling, I knew there had to be more than one. It's not just a coincidence for that to happen. There had to be more than one. And they would always stay outside of my visual sight in the fog, but I could hear them circling, going back and forth across the road. I walked faster and faster until I got in the parking lot. And then when I kept on going and I seen the building that I lived in, I started to go into a jog. I knew that if I ran, that was the end. That was it. You don't run from predators. So I was jogging, and I know, that seems like running, but I don't know if I was jogging or literally running for my life. When I got to the door, I heard the growl again. The building that I lived in was up on a hill looking over at the road, maybe a 10-foot hill. And when I looked over, I saw the silhouette of this giant dog, just the head and its eyes glowing, looking at me. When I got inside, I locked the door and I locked the deadbolt. And I was shaking and sweating profusely. I got inside and went to my room. My wife and my little girl at the time was about 5 months old. And the pure fear that if this thing would have came inside, I know the knife wouldn't have done anything. I know I could not have done anything to stop it to get to them. No matter if I threw my life in front of it, it would take me as a snack and I would not be nothing to it. In our bedroom, the bed was against the window. My wife slept close to the door, my little girl between us, and I slept towards the window. I went to crack the blinds, so I could barely peer out, and I thought, well, if I barely crack it, nothing will be able to see me inside. And beside of the apartment is a basketball court, and on that basketball court is a telephone pole that has a street light attached to it. When I looked outside, it was under the light, staring at me with its glowing amber eyes, and I knew that it could see me with everything. It was standing on 2 legs, and just standing so casual, but the look in its eyes were so cold and so dead. I just froze and took every aspect I could. It felt like an eternity staring this thing down, when I know it was maybe 2 seconds. And then it went to all fours and ran up the hill into the woods.
That had to be awfully hard to deal with. What time of night was it when you left your cousin's house?
That night I'd left around 1:20 to 1:30 in the morning.
Okay, so it was pretty late. As accurately as you can, please describe the dogman you saw that night.
Picturing the size of the telephone pole to the broadness of its chest, shoulder to shoulder, I would say at least its shoulder to shoulder was 4 to 4.5 foot wide. When I saw it in the light, I noticed it wasn't black, it was actually gray. It was darker gray, but its like underbelly and stuff like that was like a lighter gray. Its ears were tilted forward. Its head was tilted down. I could still see its teeth, even with its mouth shut, bearing out. I don't even want to call it paws. It had hands. They were huge. And I want to say that it was easily 8 foot to 8.5 foot tall. Its legs were bent back like a canine. They were very muscular at the top, at the thigh, and then bent back like a dog's would. It was very, extremely muscular. in the arms and the chest. Had a really thick, strong neck, and you could just see this huge muzzle on it.
Did you notice whether it seemed to have an expression on its face or not?
The expression it had when looking at me just told me that it let me live that night. It played with me, and I know there was more than one, but they played with me all the way to my door, and they let me live. If they didn't want me to live that night, I would not be here. It was like, I let you live tonight.
Before we spoke, did you have trouble seeing what happened for what it really was? In other words, did you spend too much time looking at what happened that night as being a case where you got away from the Dogman, or did you see it for what it was, the fact that the Dogman or Dogmen let you get away?
After it happened, I didn't tell anybody about it. I tried to just black it out, because the look in its eyes were cold and dead, like it had no remorse. It decided if I lived or died that night. I didn't. It could have ripped me apart in seconds. And knowing there is more than one, I know that me being as big as I am, there was nothing in this world I could have done.
That's right, there isn't anything you could have done. What characteristic about that Dogman disturbed you most? Was it the eyes?
The eyes disturbed me, but what really disturbed me the most was something that big moving out of the field without making a sound. I didn't hear it get up. I didn't hear it run away. It was 2 seconds. I looked away and looked back, and this giant, massive thing that I saw in the field, laying there, was gone without a trace.
It is awfully disturbing to think that something that big can be so silent. How far was it from where you first saw that Dogman to your home?
I was about 10 minutes of walking from my home. And that night, I'm pretty sure I made it from where I first saw it. And when I first saw it, it was about 15 feet away from me. But just enough out of the light to where I could just see a silhouette of it. And I made it home, I'm most likely going to say within 3 minutes, if not sooner.
Oh, I'll bet you did break a couple of land speed records getting home. I can understand that. For the last 2 years, you kept several fears that stemmed from that encounter to yourself. What's been the prominent fear?
Seeing one again. Where I live in Kentucky, like I said, there's woods everywhere. Even on the outskirts of town, it's surrounded by woods. It's a big town, but still, for it to literally go from civilization to you can walk off the main road onto a mountain and nobody even know you're there is what scares me, because you don't know if you're going to see another one, and you don't know if you're literally going to be able to make it and they're going to let you buy it again.
That is a pretty disturbing thought. You said you waited to tell anyone about that encounter. Who was the first person you told about it?
My cousin that I went to his house.
How'd he respond when you told him?
I told him he's going to think I'm crazy, and I told him just to bear with me, and I told him that I saw a Dogman, and for some reason, without any questions to it or anything, he was like, okay, I believe you. So that gives me the worries of he's either seen one or he just understands that there's things around his house that he just doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah, there's every chance he did see a Dogman out there. It's hard to know. How long did you wait to tell him about it?
That happened 2 years ago. in 2015, and I told him 2 weeks ago, and it is 2017.
It sounds to me like you two are pretty close. Why do you wait so long to tell him about it?
Because whenever you see something like this, you always worry, no matter what you see, no matter how much you want to warn people. You worry about them ridiculing you for making a hoax up or trying to just scare people or lying. And you always have that fear of people laughing at you or calling you crazy for what you saw and for what you want to warn people about. But out of that worry of being ridiculed, being put down, oh, this person's crazy, that's so funny, why would you think of something like that, they're not real, that worry just sinks down inside you, and you're so worried about what they'll say, what they'll think, what they'll do. And to be honest, I've listened to your show for about a month now, and listening to the eyewitnesses and everything, really, for them to come forward and for them to tell you about what they saw and me to understand that's what I saw, helped me to where I wanted to contact you so I could let you know my encounter and let people know, hey, they're just not over here or just in this state. They are everywhere. You just don't see them.
Yeah, they are in a lot more places than most people would ever imagine. Besides me, is he the only other person you told about that experience?
You are the third person that I've told. I told my cousin, I told my wife, and then I told you.
When you told your wife about it, was she good about supporting you, or did she laugh at you?
She's always been good at supporting me, even if she didn't have the same thoughts as I did of something. She understood that it shook me to the core. She asked me why I didn't say anything for 2 years, and I told her it just really worried me and bothered me that much. And she said, okay. Even if she doesn't believe it, she supports me. If that makes any sense.
That does make good sense. I could have read you wrong on this. I'm just wondering, is the fact that you're a big tough guy but you were so afraid of that Dogman that night one of the hardest things you've had to deal with because of that encounter?
Yeah. I've never been the one to fight people or anything like that, but I've always been the big guy, and I never liked somebody picking on the little guy. So I'd always be the one that was big enough to stand up to somebody and be like, you need to stop doing that. The pure size, the pure mass of this Dogman. I had a pocket knife with me that night. Every fiber of my being, I knew that that pocket knife was no more help than me picking up a twig. You feel so vulnerable, and to the point to where you could never fathom how weak and defenseless you feel until you stare one down and you understand that you're not on top of the food chain. This thing literally could rip me apart in 2 pieces, and it didn't even seem like it would break a sweat. And to know that if it had broken into the house that night, there was nothing that I could have forcibly done to stop it. The fear of knowing that and having the fear that if it comes in, you wouldn't be able to stop it going after your wife and daughter is the most terrifying feeling there is.
Thank goodness you knew better than to try and let the wind out of that Dogman with that knife that night. Which aspect of seeing that Dogman was worse for you, trying to deal with the trauma of actually seeing it that night or worrying about the safety of your wife and daughter?
I have insomnia, so I normally will go a day and a half easy before my body just stops and I fall asleep. After that happening, I didn't sleep for 3 nights. Laying awake, always making sure I was knowing what was going on, knowing what was around me. After that night happened, we would always have the window cracked, just slightly, maybe an inch open, and there's a screen on the other side, a metal screen. And this would always happen when they were asleep, and I'd be up and I'd be playing on my phone or just sitting there in bed, just enjoying the comfort of being around them. And the light from the basketball court would always shine in, so you could always see it. Even with the blinds closed, you would see this yellow light shining on the blinds, giving some light to the room. And there were nights that you would see this huge shadow that literally would make it seem like somebody just turned a switch off on the street light and turned it off for a split second. It would black out the street light running by the window. That happened for 2 days after my encounter. And after my encounter, 2 days also later, Fish and Wildlife was around the apartments that I lived in, and they were measuring on the electrical poles that had the streetlights on them. And I asked a friend of mine why they were doing that, and they said that they were measuring the height because they felt like a bear was marking its territory. It was 8 feet off the ground.
You mentioned your insomnia. Did you ever have any problems with nightmares because of that incident?
Yes. For about 3 to 4 months after it happened, I would have nightmares of reenactment of that night and what could have happened. There was always the nightmares of the what if. Like, what if it broke in? You just have so many fears and everything that it builds up inside you, and the nightmares can just become so realistic that you wake up and you're in a dead cold sweat, and you have to literally wait a second and look around to make sure you're okay and where you're at.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty hard nightmare to deal with. If you can't get any peace in your sleep, then you just can't get any peace, period. That's horrible. What do you think most people who listen to this show have wrong about what it's like to have a Dogman encounter, Mike?
To have a Dogman encounter, when I was younger, I had the fear and everything. I always had the scenarios in my head. Well, what if I saw one? What would I do? If I saw it do this, how would I react? When you see it, no matter what you think, no matter how big you are or anything, there is a primal fear that will shake you to your core. And every thought you have just stops, and your instincts start to take over and tell you that you are in grave danger. You're not in control of any situation when a Dogman is involved. You are the prey.
Yeah, when they're around, you definitely are if they want you to be the prey. You saw that Dogman from 15 feet away. What do you think when you hear about people who actively go into areas where they know Dogmen are, looking to have an encounter with one?
You always think that it's not as bad as what people say. You always think, well, if we have guns or we go with our friends, it will be alright. But the thing from my encounter that I can tell you is this. No matter how big and bad you think you are, no matter how many friends you have with you or the firearms, the thing is this, if you take your friends with you and you encounter a Dogman, if you escape from this and they don't, their life was in your hands and you brought them to that area. That is nothing that anybody should have on their hands or have to live with for the rest of their lives. These things are real. They could rip you apart within seconds, and there is nothing in this world you could do about it. no matter how fast you are, no matter how strong you are, they are the dominant one between you and them when that encounter happens.
You raise some good points. Yeah, when you're in their presence, there's no denying the fact that they're in control of the situation. If you walk out of there alive, it's because they let you. You told me in the pre-interview that even though it was really windy that night that you had that encounter, there was still a lot of fog. Did you find that strange at the time?
I did, because even though the wind was blowing, it was enough to swirl the fog up and mix the fog up, but wouldn't blow the fog away. And I always just had the visual of about, like I said, 20 to 25 feet. There was no farther, no nothing, but I could always hear them just outside of my visual.
With it being foggy like that, even though it was so windy, it sounds like something out of a horror film. When all this was going on, when that Dogman was just 15 feet away from you, did you ever smell any unusual scents?
The thing is, I'm used to smelling dead skunks or dead animals, stuff like that, where there's woods all around. Like, you are used to smelling the forest. Stuff kills things. You smell it. I didn't smell anything really out of the ordinary. The one thing that just really caught me off edge was, out of all the silence of the entire surrounding area of the woods and everything being hushed, other than that growl, all I could hear was the water in the creek beside of me.
Yeah, that had to be awfully creepy. Are there any aspects of your life that your encounter has affected that you wouldn't have thought it would affect?
When I'm out at night, I'm listening for that silence or just something. I'm always aware and on edge when I go outside at night. So if I do hear something, or if it goes silent like that night did, I know that I need to get to a safe place.
It's going to be some time before you can get back to good and handle things the way you want to be able to handle things outside at nighttime. Whether it's a year or 2 years down the road, who knows? But after talking with you as long as we did talk, I've got no doubts that sooner or later you're going to get to that point, and that's good news. Well, Mike, it's about time for us to get out of here. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
For the people that are looking for Dogmen, like I said, you want to believe, and a lot of people see it as seeing is believing. But you have to think of it this way. What if seeing it is believing, but you don't get to tell anybody about it? That was the last thing you saw. It is a truly frightening sight. And the horror that you feel that literally shakes through your bones. You don't know if you're going to make it that night. I was lucky. They let me live that night. I didn't get away from them. There's no way for them to move that fast without me hearing, for me to get away from them. They were playing with me all the way to my front door.
Well, Mike, I'm so glad you're seeing what you went through for what it really was. That's the key to your recovery. So, like I said, that's really good news. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mike. Thanks so much for coming on the show and telling us about that experience. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Vic.
Glad to. Have a great night, okay?
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.